Alright, welcome to another video where I'm going to be doing yet another slightly different thing, talking about the design of Triple Tonic. So I recently made a post on Reddit talking about the design process to get to where Crypt Bloom is today. People seem to really like that, and so I thought making a video about Triple Tonic might be interesting for some people. And so here we are. Yeah, let's just get right into it, talking about Triple Tonic. So, of course, Triple Tonic was designed as a replacement for Perfect Timing. I don't think it surprises anyone to say this wasn't necessarily about, oh, we really want a rune that gives 3 elixirs in the game. It was much more about, we need a rune that fits in this slot because we don't really want Perfect Timing in the game, right? Perfect Timing was Stopwatch, the rune. And I'm the person who removed Stopwatch from the item system at the time, and I did that actually pretty early on into the sort of season 2024 planning, because the AP system was the first system I was working on after removing mythics from the game, internally and testing out that system, the mythicless system. And so I had this idea of like, okay, well, can I just remove Perfect Timing from the item system and like, that seems just fine, and I removed it, and it was generally received positively. And so I said, okay, I'm not actually sure I need to remove it, the rune version, but I had our producers schedule me some time towards the end of the season, or the end of the project for replacing the rune as well. I was originally thinking, hey, maybe I don't need to replace Perfect Timing, and I can leave the rune version in the game, because I really do think ultimately the reason, the core reason why I actually really disliked Stopwatch was that we couldn't really limit people's access to it as a purchasable in the shop when it cost some amount of gold. It meant that all late game team fights ended up very deterministic, right? Every AD carry in a critical, decisive late game team fight would always have a stopwatch, right? Every fighter, every diving fighter, right? Your Jarvans and your Lee Sins would always buy stopwatch for your late game team fights, and you'd end up with these team fights where you'd have this oversaturation of stasis effects, where the Jarvan is stopwatching, and then when they jump on the Zeri also stopwatches, and then the Lee Sin goes in and kicks in the Varus, and the Lee Sin stopwatches, and then the Varus stopwatches, and you just end up with these team fights where you have 4+ stopwatches being blown, because everyone in the game knows that this is the 4th dragon fight, it's the critical team fight or whatever. Every close game would turn into a stopwatch fest, right? Because everyone would know this. Now, games that weren't close wouldn't always go this way, and I'm making it sound worse in some ways than it was, but the reality is just that I didn't think Stopwatch was good for the game, because it deterministically made a lot of effects very different in highly optimized late game team fights. This doesn't necessarily affect the average player super heavily, but for highly skilled players and for organized play, right, pro play, of course this made a really big difference, where team fights would just play out really, really differently and in ways that I didn't really feel were appropriate, and so I removed Stopwatch from the shop. However, Rune Stopwatch is different, where you have to take it from the beginning of the game. It has a much higher opportunity cost, because you could take a lane that actually helps you lane, for example, right? Like, you could take Footwear, which accelerates you 300 gold towards your items and gives you movement speed, etc., right? There are a lot of other options that you could have gone for, whereas late in the game, spending 750 gold, there's nothing that compares with that, right? The opportunity cost is almost nothing, right? And so I was personally a lot more okay with Rune Stopwatch, but if we're going to remove Stopwatch from the shop, it makes a lot of sense to remove it from the rune system as well. And so that was kind of what I signed up for very early on in the season 2024 process. I don't remember exactly when I did that. I could probably figure it out, but for the purposes of this video, it doesn't really matter. And so I agreed to set up and remove Perfect Timing from the game. So where did I start is the probably original, most interesting question. And I started by looking at the structure of the drawer. So this is something you have to really consider when you're making runes, or changing runes in any meaningful way, is what are its competitors? Of course, it's in the inspiration tree, so there's lots of weird stuff here. Inspiration in general is a pretty weird tree, and so when you're starting the design process, here, of course, there's Triple Tonic here, but at the time it was Perfect Timing, right? I looked at these 3 runes and I said, okay, so Flash Traption is a really, really narrow, but very cool, interesting, fun rune for some people. It's very, very small number of users, right? It's mostly supports and a few junglers that like to flash offensively, taking this rune. And then Footwear is an incredibly generic, broadly accessible rune, right? And so what we have here is a situation where I actually could, I had a lot of access to, a wide variety of different designs that I could theoretically make because between footwear and flash traption, I didn't have to make something super broad because footwear already exists, right? And I didn't have to make something that competes with like a medium a medium number of users because flash traption is really 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 narrow, right? I didn't have to worry about occupying some space or competing with flash traption directly because if I did, that would be okay as long as I had a moderate number of users for whatever my third option here would end up being. And so I was kind of looking at this as a very very fortunate space to work with, right? Like I think this is probably the space, one of the easiest spaces in the rune system to work on because the way that this drawer is structured, these two other options make it so that Triple Tonic could have been a moderately broad appeal rune that just competes with footwear in terms of timing, right? Because footwear is also a scaling rune essentially, right? If I made something that was broadly appealing but early game focused, that would have been fine to compete here, right? If I made something that was, say, not early game focused, but just, mildly broadly appealing to certain classes, hey, that would be okay too, as long as it's better than, footwear on some of those champions in those classes. So, I feel like this was a really big advantage for me when I kind of sat down and examined the drawer. I was thinking, okay, I actually can make this rune in a pretty small amount of time, which was good because I didn't have a lot of time to make this rune. That was sort of a problem that I was running into was that in first season 2024 stuff, lots of stuff we wanted to do, not infinite time, and so having this structure to the drawer, right, like these two runes as competitors, footwear and flash traption, I felt like was really good because we didn't want to make a drawer that was like really really narrow, and so footwear saved us there, right? It's like, well, almost every champion likes footwear at least some amount. And so the first place I started from was, okay, what champions actually like footwear the least? And how can I support them? And my immediate conclusion was like, well, basically that means you want to buy boots early, right? So that's some supports and some junglers. And so I started from the perspective of what can I give, supports and junglers in this third slot that's really appealing that, might be attractive to some of the champions that actually don't like footwear, and so might pull them into this drawer, or if they're in inspiration, might attract them maybe more than flash traption, or might be more exciting than footwear. And so the first place I thought supports and junglers was plants. So the idea here was, well, junglers are in the jungle and plants are in the jungle. They can hit plants all the time. Supports roam and walk through the jungle more frequently than the other roles, and so they can also hit plants. And so what if I made something that works on plants or gives you better effects from plants or some different effects from plants in some way? I tested a very early version of this, which just gave you gold when you killed a plant or when a nearby ally killed a plant that was close to you. We had some really great names that Phlox and I cooked up at the office for this rune, like Gold Does Grow on Trees and Midas's Hoe and stuff like that. Just these absolutely ridiculous names that were like kind of funny or in some ways, obviously some of which we could not ship, of course. But the initial my initial thoughts were like, oh, this could be cool because the junglers will walk around hitting these plants to get gold, and the supports will probably do the same thing. Maybe they'll go, they'll want to go in the enemy jungle, and that'll encourage them to ward the enemy jungle to try and snipe their plants to get gold, and that'll be fun and cool. Short answer is it was fun. Was it cool? No. It had a couple of problems. One of the first problems was that people were just no longer treating the plants as plants. You would just hit the plants because they gave you gold, and you had no thought whatsoever as to like what the plant was going to do, right? You wouldn't worry about, oh, is this blast cone going to send me in the right direction? Is this worth using? You wouldn't use the Scryer's Bloom and think, is this going to reveal me, what angle do I want to hit this at to reveal enemy wards? You would just hit the plants because they were there and because they gave you, gold. Even when the gold was pretty low, like 10 gold, that actually led to a decent amount of snowballing for junglers, and even, supports would like invade enemy jungle and like go hit their plants for money. And so it pretty quickly became clear to me that reward upon hitting plants was pretty bad because it made players treat the plants as just interactables that they didn't care about the effect of and not plants. And so I pretty quickly went back to the drawing board. Like, even though I thought plants were pretty cool as a thing that we don't have any way of interacting with in the rune system, any way of modifying in the rune system, that came up with a lot. Like, that pretty immediately came up with a bunch of problems. And I was like, well, I think some of these problems are solvable. Maybe all of them are solvable. But I didn't have a lot of time to work on this rune. And so I was kind of thinking, well, I tried a few different iterations of this. One, for example, that I tried later on to try and solve some of these problems was you get a shield that scales with the different types of plants that you kill. And so the idea was you want to hunt and specifically kill different types of plants in succession, which makes your like Malphite passive better. But it ended up being kind of complicated, hard to track, and just not, end up being super satisfying. And so I kind of dropped the plant stuff pretty quickly because it pretty quickly became clear that solving the issues with the plant rune was going to take longer than the amount of time that I had. Even though I still believe to this day you could make a good rune that involves plants, I think it needs to specifically not involve using killing the plants as a trigger, because if you do that, then people just start looking at the plants as, well, I just use this to activate my rune, not, oh, this is a blast cone, I use this to travel this wall, this is honey fruit, I use this when I'm low, or I use this when I do mana, this is Scryer's Bloom, I use this to get vision. It's like, nope, they all just turn into shield or gold or whatever the output of the rune is, right? And so that was a kind of a problem that I think is probably solvable, but wasn't solvable in the amount of time that I had. So I moved on to a different space, which some people might immediately recognize as incredibly dangerous, which is experience. So experience was another space I was thinking of like, well, this could be useful to junglers and or supports, right? And the first version I made was more targeted at supports. Because again, remember, I was still thinking at this point in the space of, well, what if I make something that is for the champions that shouldn't really like footwear as much, right? And so I was kind of thinking of this in a subtractive way of like a design of fill in the space that isn't there in this drawer. And so I started thinking about what runes could give you experience, or what minor runes that give experience could look like. And the first version was actually very simple that I made, which some people might recognize, again, as I keep saying, is like experience is a very dangerous system to mess with, right? It's obviously very risky giving experience. Experience is very powerful. Many champions you level up and you get thousands of gold worth of stats at certain points. And that's to say nothing of like rank ups, rank up incentives on spells and things like that, right? Just stats are worth a lot of gold. And so I started pretty low, low power. I started with a rune that said, when a nearby ally last hits a minion, that a nearby ally that's not you last hits a minion, and you get experience from the minion, you get 4 bonus experience. Now, you can look at this chart that I have on the left here and say, that's not that much experience, right? It's a pretty small amount. And I had mathed it out. I don't remember the exact math that I put out at that time, but basically, I had mathed this out so that it was like, hey, if you're a support and you don't roam, and your ally gets most of the last hits, because it did rely upon your ally last hitting, and your ally gets most of the last hits, this will get you about half a level-ish in the mid-game, in most cases for supports, right? If you don't roam a ton and your ally is getting most of the last hits, it gives you about half a level if you're a support. This one obviously had the downside of not doing anything for junglers, and so it was like a very, 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 very narrow rune. It was support only, essentially, because it required someone else near you to get the last hit. It tested actually reasonably well, where we played a couple of games with it, and in the mid-game it was like, okay, the supports can get level 6 before the 80 carries. That was a kind of not great part of the rune. I actually didn't really like that part because I don't think it makes that much sense. But the supports did get level 6 before the 80 carries, but then because the supports would, kind of have to go ward and interact with things that weren't the laning phase, they would still fall behind the 80 carries, but not as much as they currently do on live, or on live at the time. I guess also still true on live right now. And so it ended up being, working out the way that I predicted. However, it was really hard for the support to understand what the rune was doing for them. And it was really, really, really difficult for anyone else to understand when the support would take this rune versus not take it if it was powerful, right? If it was powerful, it just kind of felt like it was a must take for supports because, hey, half a level in the mid game is pretty powerful, right? And obviously, giving supports level 6 first before 80 carries was like not super great, right? You'd get into these situations where it was like, hey, the Xerath support is dominating the lane, or the Vel'Koz support, like mage supports would dominate the lane by getting their ultimate early and then kind of crushing the 2v2. Or potentially you'd have situations where it's like, the Nami gets level 6 first and tidal waves the enemy bot lane. If they don't know she has this rune, it's really it can totally turn the way that the game works. There not being any visuals on the rune were not great, et cetera, et cetera. There were a bunch of like kind of small problems on top of the fact that just we didn't necessarily know what this would do to bot lane, right? One of the concerns that I got when I went and I presented this rune to the other designers at one of the meetings we had to talk over design problems we're having was, well, one of the concerns people had was like, we don't really know what this does to the support role as a whole, right? Like giving them more experience, right? Is it possible that this completely redefines what the support role means, like how they operate, right? It's possible that now it's actually only mages because they have more XP or whatever, right? And so there was just a lot of risk in messing with experience. And so while I had a lot of other ideas on like different directions that I could go for an experience rune, and I still think to this day, again, it's like, I think some of these problems are solvable, and like, yes, working with experience is very dangerous because it can really upset the game. I pretty quickly came to the conclusion of like, hey, I think it's probably a little too risky to keep working on this project in terms of experience. I'm going to try something different again. So what ended up happening was I was talking with Phlox. And honestly, this is how a lot of the designs went. I don't remember who had this idea, but it's like, we're talking about experience. It was like, well, the dangerous part of experience really is the level, the stats that you get for leveling up, right? It's not really the skill point. And we actually have the ability to give people skill point, right? At the time we were talking about this, right, Elixir of Skill wasn't in the game, right? It was removed from the game with Kleptomancy because Kleptomancy was the only way to get Elixir of Skill previously. But Elixir of Skill was something that was kind of interesting as a way to give people something that's clearly powerful. You can understand why this is good. If no matter how good or bad at the game you are, you can understand why a skill point is powerful, right? It just makes your champion stronger, right? But it doesn't come with the kind of, I think, in the context of a minor rune, the downside of giving potentially thousands of gold worth of stats, right? And so we ended up on Elixir of Skill, and I said, okay, let me try and see what this is. And I tried a version of this where you get an Elixir of Skill at level 9. The reason why I tried level 9 in the very beginning was because Elixir of Skill is kind of complicated to explain to players, like why you can't rank things early, right? There are certain rules about what spells you can rank, and it makes it a lot easier to understand if we give it to you at level 9. And when it doesn't affect your first max, it's a lot less powerful, and therefore it's a lot easier for us to control, right? One of the other concerns with the experience thing, by the way, was that this is a minor rune. Minor runes really aren't supposed to be worth that much gold, right? Take Magical Footwear, for example. It literally just gives you 300 gold and then some bonus stats on top of that, right? But when you think about it, it also locks you out of buying boots early, so it has a downside. So it's worth around, we estimate around like 400 to 500-ish gold to get Magical Footwear. And so we're not allowed to give you that much gold worth of stats in a minor rune slot. And so giving you an Elixir of Skill at level 1, for example, would probably be worth more than 500 gold, right? Because you would get access to an extra skill point super, super, super early. And so level 9 was where I started it, where I was like, okay, it's less confusing and it's not that powerful. So I put that into testing, right? Immediately the feedback was extremely, extremely positive, right? Even though it was pretty clearly bad, right? People pretty quickly identified, this rune is bad, but I still like it, right? I actually want to take this. I like getting Elixir of Skill. Getting the extra skill points really fun. And I can see how it would be powerful, right? And so I had lots of suggestions from people who had playtested the rune, like, oh, it could just give a second Elixir of Skill, or you could give an Elixir of Skill at an earlier level, or whatever. But I pretty quickly came to the conclusion that I didn't want to give multiple Elixirs of Skill, because that could make your skill distribution like really, really, really different and hard to understand, like, hey, why is this person's skill really different? And so I pretty quickly came up with the conclusion, looking at Kleptomancy, which is where Elixir of Skill came from. I was like, why don't I bring back like the travel size elixir of force or whatever. I forget what it was called. I think travel size elixir of something. I don't remember. Basically, Kleptomancy had solved this same problem for me already, which was they made smaller versions of the elixirs, which gave you temporary power, right? And so my thought was, why don't I do the same thing? And so I made this elixir of force, as well as the elixir of a mini elixir of iron, right? which at the time I don't remember what I was calling them, but I called them, mini elixir of force and mini elixir of iron, I think. And so one of them gave adaptive, and one of them gave the health and the a little bit of tenacity, I think. And originally I gave 2 elixirs of force, right? I wasn't sure if I really wanted to give 2 different kinds of elixirs, and so I said, at level 3 you get an elixir of force, at level 6 you get an elixir of force. And so I took this back to the design and had Froxon play the rune in tests, and he said, okay, it seems good. It's a little boring that you get the same elixir twice. Can you make this rune a little more exciting? But otherwise, it seems really good. And I had pretty much the same thought. And so I said, okay, so I gave you a miniature elixir of iron at level 3 instead. And so what ended up happening was you got a little bit. I think it was 100 health at level 3, which was really powerful, by the way. Obviously, that was really crazy for like level 3 all-ins. And then I ran into a problem, right? Which was, okay, so both the level 3 and the level 6 elixir are combat effects. So if I make them not stack, this means that it's a weird rune because it makes it so that you really want to have to be able to fight at level 3 and at level 6. Or you have to have a specific all-in window twice in the laning phase, which was kind of weird. But if I made them stack, then it ran into this problem where, well, you really just wanted to wait till level 6 and you stacked both of them, and then you all into your lane opponent. You had the bonus health and you had the bonus adaptive from the elixir of force, right? And so that kind of led to a bunch of problems. And so I ended up deleting the elixir of force and saying, hey, or sorry, not the elixir of force, the mini elixir of iron, and saying, hey, we want a different type of effect at level 3. So what if it's kind of like a farming elixir? It's about, hey, first you farm at level 3, then you all in at level 6, and then at level 9 you get the elixir of skill and you scale. And so we're giving you something that does something a little bit different, but they're all reasonably powerful at each level break point. Is that good? Because this basically would resolve the problems I had with the offering 2 different kind of combat elixirs. And so that's why I made Elixir of Avarice, which originally was bonus true damage on hit and bonus gold per minion, but that had some really unfortunate optimizations around, you like want to group up the enemy minions, you want to like freeze on your side of the lane and like build up a really, or you want to get the enemy's wave to like slow push into you, and then you pop the elixir and start lasting a ton of stuff. So that had really awkward optimizations, and so I changed it to just, hey, when the effect expires, you get gold, and it makes it easier to last hit. That's why it works like this, instead of just like giving you gold on minion kill or whatever. And that ended up testing really well. Pretty much immediately, people were like, wow, this rune is really fun. I really like taking this rune. I want to, take this rune more, right? And so that's kind of how this process ended up. To kind of sum it up, we went from let's replace Stopwatch to let's try something with plants. Okay, plants, would require a lot of work to make something good here. Okay, let's try experience. Okay, well, experience is really dangerous, and we don't necessarily want to make something that's targeted only at the support role. Okay, let's try Elixir of Skill. Okay, Elixir of Skill is really good, but by itself it's not good enough. All right, let's try making some other, timed elixirs that can be good with this. The double Elixir of Force version was kind of boring. Let's try Elixir of Iron, mini Elixir of Iron plus Elixir of Force. Okay, well, this has some weird optimizations around all-inning people. Okay, let's replace the Elixir of Iron with a farming elixir. And that's kind of how the design process went. Hopefully you could follow this thought process. And hopefully this was illuminating for talking about Triple Tonic and, the kind of design behind it. But yeah, that's it for Triple Tonic. Let me know if you like this video, if you want to see more stuff like this, more stuff like my previous videos or different stuff. Thanks for watching, and catch you next time.